Home prices are now officially dropping in the state of Florida, and in this video, I'm going to tell you how much they're going to drop in the future. Because the one thing you should understand as a Florida home buyer or investor is that the housing market here is in a big bubble right now, with home values about 25% above the long-term 50-year trend. You can see the only other time we've seen prices get this high above trend was the 06-07 bubble before the big crash. And what scares me about Florida's housing market in 2025 and beyond is its interest rate sensitivity. Florida is a housing market that does best when interest rates are low and declining. Meanwhile, it struggles when interest rates are high and increasing. As you can see, Florida's average home price growth over the last 50 years is 5.4% a year, which is pretty good. However, notice in the last 20 years how there's been increasing volatility up above and below that average. And according to data on Reventure App, we're now officially in negative home price growth territory in Florida. Prices are down about 0.5% over the last year across the state, with some markets down as much as 7% over the last year. Now, a big question you might be wondering is, why is this happening? Because what we're told in the mainstream news media down here in Florida is that this is a place where everyone is moving and that this is a place where you can expect home prices to keep going up. So why actually are we seeing them drop? Well, the answer to that question has to do with a big slowdown in the migration of people moving into the state, which you can see represented on this graph, which tracks the domestic migration into Florida, the number of net Americans moving into the state. You can see the long run average for migration is 134,000 people a year. You can see these migration figures skyrocketed during the pandemic all the way to a peak of 315,000 positive migration in 2022. However, since then, things have changed and changed fast, with Florida's net migration levels plummeting all the way to 64,000 in 2024, the fifth lowest level on record going back 35 years. So we're literally coming off one of the worst years for Florida migration in history, which explains why home prices are starting to drop and why the supply of homes available for sale on the market is spiking, with the for sale inventory on the Florida housing market up to 153,000 homes entering 2025. That's the highest level of supply in nearly a decade, which is ultimately good news for you if you're a prospective home buyer in Florida over the next couple of years. It's likely that you're going to see more homes for sale. It's likely that you're going to see more price cuts and have a better buying environment. The question is just how much are home prices going to drop? Because if we go all the way back to the last time we had a housing bubble in Florida in 2006, 2007, the crash ended up being really, really bad. You can see that values in Florida in the last housing crash went down 49% from '07 to 2012. That was the third biggest decline in America of any state after only Arizona and Nevada. In Orlando, home values dropped 53%. In Miami, they dropped 52%. And in Tampa, they dropped 49%. Now, I'm not saying we're going to see another 50% crash this time around. However, I think it's important for any home buyer or homeowner in Florida to understand what the recent history of Florida's housing market is. It wasn't that long ago where we saw a colossal decline in home prices, indicating that Florida is actually a very volatile housing market. Prices here over the last 25 years tend to either boom or crash and not do much in between. We can see that today home values in Florida are 23% overvalued from their long-term norms, according to data available on Reventure App. This 23% overvaluation has improved a bit in the last couple of years as prices have edged down and incomes have gone up, but it's still well above the long-term norm, indicating that if you buy in Florida's housing market today, there is a higher than average likelihood that prices will drop in the future. And it's those high costs which have started driving people out of the state. So not only are there fewer people now moving to Florida, there's now more people leaving Florida who already live here. And this is a problem, not only for Florida's housing market, but also its society and economy. There's a big section of the people leaving Florida are younger people. It's the age segment of 20 to 40 years old that is actually fleeing Florida in droves, with a new study done by Florida's Chamber of Commerce showing that in 2023, Florida lost more people in the age segment of 20 to 29 than it gained. So this light blue bar showed more out-migration than in-migration. The dark blue bar for 20 to 29. For 30 to 39, it was equal. And for 40 to 49, there was actually more outbound migration as well. The only age segments that Florida gained in 2023 were 50 to 69, which kind of goes back to how Florida, used to run. Florida is a retirement destination. It's where the baby boomers go. During the pandemic, that changed a little bit, but starting in 2023, and I'm sure when the 2024 data is updated, it's going to show a similar trend. Younger people moving out of Florida, older people moving into Florida. If you want to have a sustainable housing market where prices grow in the long run, you're going to need to fix those trends, because you cannot have 20 to 29-year-olds fleeing your state in droves and expect that housing demand is going to hold up in the long run. And we're actually already seeing this outbound migration from Florida show up in the home sale figures, everyone. Because it's really interesting. I talked to a lot of realtors down here in Florida. I talked to a lot of mortgage brokers. I talked to a lot of regular homeowners. And a lot of them still have this perception, or at least they claim, that people are still buying houses in Florida. I hear realtors all the time down here say, demand is strong. Everyone's moving here. This is the place people want to be. But when you look at the data on home sale transactions, it does not look so good. You look at this graph from Redfin, which measures the weekly adjusted home sales in Florida, you can see a huge drop in home sales over the last 3 years. So actually at the peak of the pandemic, in December 2019, Florida did 10,000 weekly adjusted home sales. Now fast forward to the end of December in 2024, what did Florida do? 5,900 weekly adjusted home sales. This is a trailing 12-week average, so it smooths out the ups and downs. It smooths out the seasonality. You can see we're down almost 40% from the pandemic high in home sales. And even worse, we're down about 20% from pre-pandemic sales. So quite literally, we have the lowest home buyer demand in Florida that we've seen in a decade. And what's amazing to me is that no one knows that here in Florida. No one seems to be aware that the demand has crashed and collapsed. And the reason I think people aren't aware of it is, number one, realtors control the narrative on the housing market here, and they're not going to tell you that. But number two is that prices are still high. Prices have only edged down 0.5%, 1%, maybe 5% year over year. In certain pockets of Florida. So it doesn't really feel to the average home buyer like a collapse or a crash has taken place. The reason is because sellers are still stubbornly holding out on high prices. Like on a listing like this in northern Tampa near Wesley Chapel, the 4-bed, 3-bath, 3,000 square feet, you can see it's listed at $557. Now this is down about $70,000 from the peak valuation in 2022. So there is a correction taking place here. However, it's still at a price that's $200,000 more than it sold for in 2017. So this owner is still trying to get a huge level of appreciation, even though the market in this area has slowed considerably and the buyer demand has plummeted. Of course, Florida wasn't always this way, everyone. It wasn't always overvalued and overpriced. In fact, that's a recent phenomenon that developed during the pandemic. If you go into Florida's housing market prior to the pandemic, values were actually very affordable. You could actually buy a house in Florida in 2019, and your monthly mortgage payment, folks, would be only, get this, $1,000 a month. If you bought a house in Florida in 2019, that was the average mortgage payment back then. You can see back then in late 2019, Florida was very affordable. It was a great time to buy back then. And a lot of people have actually made a lot of money in Florida's housing market. If you bought in Florida anywhere from 2010 to 2020, you made a killing on your home purchase. You did very well, and you probably have lots of equity, and your perception is likely that Florida is a great place to buy real estate. However, what I would tell you is that Florida is a very cyclical market, and your future return expectations on buying a house or investment property are very much linked to when you buy. For instance, right now, Tampa, St. Pete, home prices are 26% overvalued, indicating it's not such a great time to buy a house for future return expectations. However, if you had bought In 2017, 2018, 2019, home prices back then were fairly valued. If you had bought in 2011, 2012, prices back then were 30% undervalued. So looking at this over undervaluation metric is a good guidepost into helping you understand your future growth potential of buying in Florida depending on when you make your purchase. And what's important to understand about housing downturns, everyone, is that they are slow. They are actually very slow. The last housing crash, the one we talked about before where prices went down 50% in Florida, that happened from '07 to 2012. It was a 5-year downturn. Prices went down for 5 years in a row. And you can see if we look at this historical home value data on Reventure App, the prices started going into negative year-over-year territory around June '07 is when prices started going into negative territory, and they stayed in negative territory here in Florida for literally the next 5 years. And so you could see here in this cycle, price growth peaked at 27% in 2022, and then the appreciation has now slowed and is now starting to go into negative territory. But if history were to repeat itself, this would be the start of multiple years of price declines. And the reason I'm making this video for you, everyone, is because I live down here in Florida now. I have lived here for 5 months. And I am continually amazed at how many people don't know the information I'm telling you in this video. I would say most people down in Florida don't really understand what the local housing market down here is. I just went to lunch today actually, and I overheard someone talking about why they love owning real estate in St. Petersburg, and they said to their friend they love it because they know it's a stable asset that's just going to go up in the long run. And in my head, I'm saying it's actually the exact opposite. This is the most volatile housing market in America where you could lose lots of money if you buy at the wrong time or are over leveraged. And one really interesting thing is that Florida wasn't always this way. If we go back to the long-term home price growth graph all the way back to 1976 and compare it to inflation, what do you see? Is that from 1976 all the way to 2000, home prices in Florida tracked the rate of inflation, meaning that Florida was actually a very stable market in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But then something changed in 2001. Florida's housing market fundamentally changed in that year because it started behaving in a way that we had never really seen in recent history, where the home prices in 2001 leapt up to 10% growth. And they stayed at 10% growth and then went to 26% growth, all the while the inflation rate in the US stayed between 2 and 4%. The inflation rate stayed pretty stable, yet the home prices in Florida went way up. We had never seen that before. Then prices in Florida crashed from '07 to 2012, while the inflation rate again stayed relatively similar. Then price growth in Florida leapt back up to 8, 9% year over year, 6% year over year, then up to 25%, way above the rate of inflation. So interestingly, from 2000 all the way to 2024, Florida home prices really haven't tracked the rate of inflation at all. They've completely detached. They've either been way above or way below or way above and potentially way below again. And in 1 second, I'm going to give you my home price forecast for Florida in 2025 in terms of the percentage that I think prices are going to drop in Florida this year. But before I do, I want to explain why Florida has become increasingly volatile. Because I did some research into this because I looked at that last graph and I was like, wow, how is it that home prices in Florida don't have any relationship to inflation anymore? And it's because of what the Federal Reserve started to do in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, the Federal Reserve in America started to engage in artificial interest rate suppression. That's when, in 2001, they cut interest rates. When Alan Greenspan cut interest rates all the way from 5% on the way down to 1.5%, something we had not seen before in US history. Then, only 6 or 7 years later, the Federal Reserve did a massive bailout of the economy during the great financial crisis. And then, of course, during the pandemic, they did another financial bailout. They printed $5 trillion, cut interest rates to zero. And in that environment, when the Fed is suppressing interest rates and printing money, that money ends up flowing into Florida's housing market. There's more money in the financial system. There's more money in people's pockets. So what do? They buy a second home, they buy a third home, they buy an investment property, or they build a home in Florida, which is what enables Florida to now achieve such high home price growth above the fundamentals the last 25 years, because you just had all this external capital flowing into the state based off the Fed printing money and cutting rates. But now we have a problem, everyone. Mortgage rates and interest rates are going back up. The 30-year mortgage rate in America is now back to 7.2%. Everyone, 7.2% 30-year mortgage rate. It's just gone up actually since the Fed started cutting rates. And you could see really for the last 2 years, mortgage rates have been around 7%. And not so coincidentally, it was 2 years ago when home sale demand in Florida, buyer demand collapsed. So I'm left wondering, is Florida's housing market capable of sustaining itself in this new interest rate and Fed monetary policy environment where interest rates and mortgage rates are back to their long-term multi-decade norms? A 7% mortgage rate actually isn't that high historically. However, it is high compared to what we saw in the last 20 to 25 years. And I suspect it's probably too high for Florida's housing market to sustain its current price levels. That's why the Reventure App home price forecast score for the state of Florida is a 38 out of 100 going into 2025. And what a 38 out of 100 means, everyone, is a downward price forecast, a heavy buyer's market. We've gone from a big seller's market in Florida on the Reventure forecast 3 years ago to now a big buyer's market in 2024. And what this forecast does is it predicts the future direction of prices. So a year ago, the forecast was a 48, indicating slight decline in prices. Sure enough, prices went down slightly over the last year. Well, now we've shifted to even more of a buyer's market on the Reventure App price forecast score, indicating a sharper decline in prices could be coming in 2025. And what we're looking at here, everyone, is a score of 38 corresponding to roughly a 3 to 4% decline in prices year over year. So that's our official forecast for Florida at Reventure App for 2025 is a 4% decline in prices. However, we have lots of variation around that average depending on where you go in Florida. What I would encourage you guys to do if you're a home buyer and investor wanting to understand the future of prices in Florida in 2025 is head to www.reventure.app and access this home price forecast score under a premium plan. The cost of a premium plan is $39 a month, and that will give you access to all our most popular data, home price forecasts, overvaluation rates, cap rates, population growth, as well as long-term 5-year growth rates, as well as 40 other premium data points. I think if you're a home buyer in Florida in 2025, you really need to arm yourself with the data on the historical trends in your area so you can understand what you're getting into, as well as the potential future trends over the next 12 months through the home price forecast score, through the overvaluation rate. You can access all of that at www.reventure.app. Go there right now, sign up for a plan.